for you guys to grab. D.W. Rollins, from contributing author from Greater Washington, and Tom Hickey, Chief Development Officer for VRE, and he'll be giving a presentation after Bruce on DC's build towards regional rail, which will actually kind of set the stage for the discussion the panel will have throughout the hour. So, Bruce, up to you.
Thank you, Joe. As most of you know, I do not work for Metrolinx, so I was put up to do this. No, I volunteered, only because I'm the one who lives closest to GO Transit, and as you know, I live in Buffalo. So, Norman, you're back there. We could have, you ride GO, so you don't? Oh, you just walk. Okay. You see GO. You see GO. Right. Okay. So, unfortunately, Metrolinx was unable to provide a representative to either come to D.C. They had an international travel ban to the U.S. You can read into that what you want. In addition, we were trying to get them remotely, but that also didn't work. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of slides about Metrolinx and about GO Transit and what their plans are, which are very ambitious, and really for North America will be the first large city to have the sort of Paris RER type system in the country if it gets built out as they're envisioning it. I thought I'm doing it. Oh, what's going on here? Hang on. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. So, Metrolinx is a province of Ontario, provincial corporation formed in 2006. Again, one of their operations is GO Transit, Government of Ontario Transit. They also operate the UP Pearson Express, which is the train that operates between Toronto Union Station and Pearson Airport, Toronto's international airport. But the overarching agency, and they don't use the word agency in Canada, is Metrolinx from the planning and execution standpoint. Metrolinx is charged with, like our MPOs, with coming up with regional transportation plans, which is, again, similar to our MPO process. Just a slide showing the Greater Toronto area, and if you live up in our neck of the woods, it's referred to the GTA. I got that right, Norman, right? Okay, the GTA, we all know that. And we're lucky in Buffalo as we get Toronto TV, and they're lucky in Toronto as they get Buffalo TV. So we feel very close to Toronto and Buffalo. You got it. The Greater Toronto area, though, has a population of at least 6 million. So a very large metropolitan area, obviously the largest metropolitan area in Canada, and certainly, though, on scale with any of the large metropolitan areas here in the U.S. The word or the phrase that they're using is the big move, not the big dig, but the big move is their 30-year plan to improve their regional transit system. What's important on this slide is the second line. That is 30 billion in Canadian dollars, obviously, but 30 billion investment in the GTA's rapid transit network being either planned, in process, or in the future. Think about that. $30 billion from one regional metropolitan area. GO includes, again, the rail component. GO Transit is both a rail operator and an extensive bus operator that feeds into rail. They also, within the overall planning, take care of light rail transit. We're going to look at a little bit more of that in a second. And they also are working on a couple of different bus rapid transit BRT operations. What will be most interesting to our group, however, though, is talking about the transformation of the GO network. GO, again, started many years ago, the spine running east-west along Lake Ontario from Toronto. And at the moment, in normal, well, actually, it's 7 days a week, you can come in on Lakeshore West, which is the line that I take. If I drive from Buffalo, go across the border, drive up to Burlington, Ontario, get on the GO train to go to Toronto, it's half-hour service now. So half-hour frequency from Aldershot, which is the end of their operating zone, into Toronto. There'll be a map coming. I know you're going to say, well, that's not the end. There's a map coming. Their plan, however, is to completely electrify the bulk of their system. If you were here earlier, you saw I had a video up that's from YouTube that had a whole bunch of GO trains, 4-track line. that will within 3, 4, 5 years be fully electrified. Most remarkably, though, from the passenger perspective, it will be 15-minute headways. So from Aldershot, Burlington, any of the communities along Lake Ontario, east and west, you don't need a timetable. It's every 15 minutes, which I can tell you is a lot better than Metro here in D.C. some days, obviously, as we know. So, and that will be possible based upon the electrification. It will be all new electrified equipment. As noted here, 52 new train sets, new tracks. They've already put in, at this point, 150 kilometers of new line. 22 stations are being upgraded. 45 bridges have been upgraded. There is constant work going on the current system to get the infrastructure in place to go to that next step, which will be the electrification step. And as it noted on the right side, 263 kilometers of electrified service. So this is not just one little line. This is a major overhaul of their entire system. Here's a map of the general system, sort of a schematic. Green is the GO network. There's also a line, the Pearson Express network, which goes up to the airport from Union Station. Then the other lines are current subway and or light rail. Not to be confused with Toronto's extensive system of streetcars, which still run in the streets on major routes in Toronto. So just a couple of examples of, again, what they're working on, not just on the heavy rail regional GO network, crosstown light rail that will connect different parts further out in Toronto, further north from downtown. That is in progress. An 11-kilometer Finch West light rail project, again, extending the reach of rail, connecting into its core original legacy systems. Mississauga is a very large community to the northwest of downtown Toronto. This line would connect from the lakeshore at the bottom of that map up through Mississauga. And again, connecting with multiple GO lines, so you'd have connectivity between light rail and into the GO heavy rail. Hamilton, Ontario, which is down at the western end of Lake Ontario, which is the end of the GTA. Hamilton, Ontario is a city. The city itself has 550,000 residents, so a very large city. Also, large major steel production is done in Hamilton for Canada. And the light rail system there partly is already in service and more is coming. In addition, there's subway expansion underway. They just opened a new extended of a line last year. I've not been up there to be able to ride that line, but they are working on other extensions. That, again, would be subway. So we have subway, we have light rail, we have GO heavy rail. And again, this doesn't even include the Toronto Transport Commission, which operates the bus and streetcar systems. And there are also extensions of some of the streetcar lines being planned. And so there is a general map. Everything focuses in on Union Station, which again is served by both VIA and by the Maple Leaf Amtrak's New York to Toronto train, in addition to all of the GO services, both rail and bus. And these red lines on this map are the existing subway routes. One of the exciting things for us in Buffalo is that they are extending year-round service to Niagara Falls, Ontario, which is very close to Niagara Falls, New York. Again, only a couple hundred feet apart, but of course there's a river in between, and it is two different countries. So they have just started, just in January, a weekday, one train up in the morning, one train back at night, commuter service that will within, well, we'll see what happens, in theory, within 3 to 4 years, will be regular 7-day-a-week, multiple, I won't say 15-minute headway, but no, maybe every hour headway from Toronto to Niagara Falls and back. We in Buffalo would love to see GO Transit come across the river, but being a realist, that's not going to happen. The only commonality is the track gauge being 4 foot 8.5 inches. Unfortunately, getting across the border would be an insurmountable hurdle. But that's just a short overview, but again, to think what is happening, and number I'll leave in your mind, $30 billion in transportation, public transportation investment by the province of Ontario. This isn't even the federal government of Canada, the province of Ontario. Thank you.
Sneak preview. Thank you, Bruce. And I now introduce Tom Hickey from VRE to give a presentation of what's going on here in DC, and then we'll get to the panel. So,
good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Hickey, as Joe mentioned. I'm with VRE. For the last 5 years, I've been the Chief Development Officer at the Virginia Railway Express, and we've been working on some plans there, and I'll get into a little bit of those. But let me just say, today's presentation, I'll first make some the case for regional rail, when we use that term, what at least we at VRE are referring to. I want to bring up a case study, Philadelphia's Center City Commuter Connection. That's the official name, the CCCC, for the tunnel in Center City, and you have to be of a certain age to still be using that term. And then how that transfers to what we have in mind for the Virginia Railway Express after a brief overview of what Virginia Railway Express is, since I recognize that some people here are from out of town. First of all, commuter rail traditionally fills a niche between rail rapid transit, whether it be light rail or metro, and intercity rail, focusing on low-density suburban, exurban travel markets for travelers, and fairly far station spacing. Because of that station spacing, commuter rail can get speeds up to 79 miles an hour, or an average commercial speed of about 45 miles an hour, which is greater than what metros can do, which have to stop for people a lot more often. And of course, intercity markets can be are all under redefinition now, but generally 50 to 300 miles in length. So commuter rail versus regional rail. The philosophy came from a massive conversion that took place in some of the commuter rail network in Paris. The Regional Express Network, or RER, attempted to, and did a very good job actually, of integrating rapid transit type operating principles using commuter rail technology. Commuter rail being traditionally focused on getting commuters into the central job market in the morning and bringing them back in the evening. RER provided a bi-directional all-day type of service, less frequent than metro, but still faster and longer distance than travel by metro can be in comparable markets, using what we would traditionally call a railroad type of technology and rolling stock. 5 Parisian commuter rail lines have been converted to RER since 1977. The shift for us, it represents a shift in our operating practice. Right now, we predominantly run into the city in the morning and bring people out in the evening. We serve the company town. We're looking at trying to provide reverse peak train service so that in this case we can connect DC and Northern Virginia residents with jobs in Northern Virginia and elsewhere. Also trying to introduce evening and midday service. I would also say there's a lot of interest in weekend service, but I'm not allowed to say that since it's our policy that we can't run weekend service. So we'll leave that on the table for now. Several North American examples, SEPTA that I'll get into. Bruce just provided a very good case. Toronto's always had a fairly bidirectional system, and now they're going whole hog on it. New York City, both NJ Transit and the MTA commuters systems run a fairly extensive midday and off-peak service. That make easily travel. Boston to an extent, although they're working at improving that. And Caltrains with San Jose at one end, and I grew up in the middle of that line, so it's funny for me growing up knowing that that's the line to San Francisco. San Jose wasn't anything back in the 60s. Now, it's a bidirectional service, which has as many people wanting to get to San Jose now every morning as wanting to get to San Francisco. So that system has just naturally evolved as geography has taken over it. So let me talk about SEPTA, Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. How many people here are more than familiar with SEPTA? Okay, so I'm not starting totally from scratch. SEPTA runs a predominantly EMU type of operation with, they do have a couple locomotive haul train sets, but for the most part, I often make the case when I'm talking about mode and what, equipment doesn't matter. SEPTA is really a light rail system that's running railroad technologies, as opposed to other lines where sometimes some light rail lines, like in St. Louis and Illinois, is really more of a commuter rail line using light rail technology. But when you look at the operation and the functional capacity and station spacing and such, SEPTA runs a pretty intensive network. This is what the system looked like at the turn of the 80s. The green lines are commuter rail lines. There's a small distinction, if your eye is good, between a light green and a dark green line, and that's how SEPTA used to designate between the Pennsy and the Reading systems. This is a simpler diagram that's more operationally demonstrates what the system used to look like in I picked 82 as a pre-tunnel activity. We had 6 branches on the Pennsylvania Railroad side all coming together at Suburban Station. An unfortunate name for a Center City station. I have actually not, this is not apocryphal, I have stood there at the airport station and had tourists saying, I'd love to go into Center City, and I don't know where that station is, but I know it's not the one called Suburban Station. Well, Suburban Station. So the whole Pennsy system converged at 30th, still does converge at 30th Street Station on the outskirts of Center City, and then runs into Suburban Station for Center City access. On the other side of town, 5 blocks across town, was the Reading network that focused in on Reading Terminal. And it was, again, a commuter rail system, 6 branches. Several urban branches, those are where it really looks like light rail. And some outlying branches in 82. I picked 82 because I didn't have to worry about the diesel services, which were abandoned a month or a year earlier. So it was a more extensive system of diesel lines going further out, but this is the core electric system. So it was proposed, it was long proposed, Ed Tennyson, if that name means anything to anybody, renowned transit visionary in Milwaukee, thank you, sir, Philadelphia, and ended up down in Arlington County here before he passed away just a few years ago. Ed was with the city of Philadelphia and pushed for and created the whole concept of the Center City Tunnel, shown here in orange, which was tunneling for about 1.5 miles downtown to connect the Pennsy system with the Reading system, eliminating the traditional Reading Terminal station and replacing it with a Market East station, which was underground and just slightly a little bit to the east of it. So that trains could through run from one side of the system to the other. Part of the vision, Ed was working with another Ed Bacon, who you may all know as Kevin Bacon's father, who was a renowned city planner in Philadelphia in the 50s and 60s, and envisioned a great deal of development on the east side of Market Street to match what was on the west side of Market Street. The west side of Market Street, when the Pennsylvania Railroad eliminated Broad Street Station in the 50s and created Suburban Station as the only connection, it left a large chunk of real estate that got turned into high-rise buildings off what in Philadelphia passed as a skyscraper on the west side of town, which was a great job, great draw of regional jobs. So the notion here was, let's do something on the east side of Market Street to balance the system, but also create a lot of development. Down there in the lower right side, you can see the vision of a train station replacing Reading Terminal underground and under this whole development. So the commuter rail connector was under construction. You can imagine what it was like to try to build a 1.5 mile tunnel under existing infrastructure in the Center City. This is the old Reading Terminal shed, which you can see is being held up by these large pipes in the center of the picture. It was actually quite impressive to watch the construction taking place. But in the end, Reading Terminal was replaced with Market East Station, which is a 4-track underground station that is in service today. 4 tracks, each track had the capacity of, was designed with the capacity of a train every 3 minutes. So that was 20 trains per hour per track, and a total throughput of 40 trains per hour per direction through the Center City. So when the tunnel opened in '85 and the system was integrated, it was now being operated by SEPTA employees directly, which also helped with some of the conversion. Once we got that nasty 108-day strike over work rules out of the way, everything worked fine. The system was redefined where each branch was known by its destination. Now you had an integrated system that of through routes. So you have things like the R5, which start as the blue line on the left on the Pensy side, goes through the tunnel and then comes out on the as the R5 on the Reading side. We abolished the terms Reading and Pensy side, although that's what we had to use internally to keep track of which side of the railroad we were talking about. But there were a number of routes. Don't ask me where where R4 is. That's a whole nother discussion, and I'll be happy to talk to somebody talk during over a beer about that sometime. But in any event, so the systems were paired up based on Dr. Vucek from the University of Pennsylvania did an analysis of what the optimal pairings of routes would be to maximize through routing. But even through routing through a tunnel isn't a panacea because only one line gets the opportunity to be a one-seat ride. Everybody else has to transfer. So that, but there's not a 5-block walk involved as it was in the pre-tunnel days to make the transfer. Oops. Okay, good. I hope I wasn't falling apart there. Key to the operation are those 2 yellow diamonds that I've showed, which is to say you can't run everything through. You have to recognize that it's just inefficient, especially to run in rush hour when you have 6-car trains coming in from one side of the system in a rush hour traffic. You don't have the same type of traffic going out from Center City. So from that standpoint, you're running a bunch of empty seats and long consists. So what was done was there's a storage yard provided. There was always one on the above 30th Street Station at Powelton Yard where trains could go and reside during midday. On the Reading side, we had to create one at a place called Roberts Yard up by Wayne Junction, and that provided an opportunity to have some trains that weren't running through to have a short place to park to as opposed to running to the end of the line. We're actually trying to build one of those in Washington, D.C. right now for the VRE system. But you had this core system of Market East, Suburban Station, and 30th Street Station. And right after the tunnel opened, 2 things happened. We started what is shown here in yellow as the R1 on the Pensy side, which was the airport line, which was just opened, we already unbalanced the system. And University City became a major destination for trips. The major significant change in ridership that we identified right away was not necessarily expected. But what identified was most of the ridership gains from the tunnel, post-tunnel, in the 5 years following the tunnel, were on the Reading side. And the reason for that was, as I mentioned, there was a large office complex of buildings called Penn Center between Suburban Station and 30th Street Station. The people on the Reading side never had direct access to those. So the Reading people now having one-seat ride, some diverted from the Pensy lines and rode a line that was closer to them but less convenient because of the transfer. Others just because, hey, I can now get here on a one-seat ride. That was where the greatest ridership gain was. There was some ridership gain attributable to trains running through, but it depended on if there was some place to go. As you can imagine, there needs to be a there to attract trips. So, for example, on the Pensy side, R5 line, there were a number of suburban office complexes and schools, Villanova University, Rosemont, Bryn Mawr, Haverford, all close and basically clustered around the train stations. So that provided an incentive for people to ride through the tunnel and have a one-seat ride to these schools as opposed to commute by car. Unfortunately, the suburban office locations were very rarely ever next to a train station. So SEPTA started something called the 200 series routes, which were dedicated bus extensions of commuter rail to serve those office parks that were greater than a longer walk, and that helped again and provide the incentive for reverse peak ridership. But again, that was on both sides of the R5, but for the most part, and the airport, by the way, was a great generator of work trips as well for the airport employees. But for the most part, the reverse peak service did not really attract many people because there was just no place within a walking distance of a train station to get off and walk. Interestingly enough, the R2 going down to Wilmington, I was railroad administrator in Delaware for a while. Hi, Ken. We attracted a lot of trips there because a banking center had grown up around the Wilmington train station. But also, we had people who were, interestingly enough, leaving a car at their destination station overnight so that they had a way of making their own way to a job market further off. That's a phenomenon you see. But again, the real potential, you look at this network and the whole network is there saying, wow, we can run this like a metro. But you've got to have a reason for people to be traveling, which gives us the incentive to run that level of, the economics of running trains. So as you look at this network, the R5 and the airport R1 were the only lines that were running 30-minute off-peak services as a base headway. All the other lines to this day run hourly service. Looking at regional rail today, there's been a couple other interesting things that have happened in the intervening 30-some plus years. One, SEPTA has really focused on that yellow zone, what I would call the center, the center city zone as a destination as opposed to it being in the middle. So where when the tunnel first opened, they only had the R schedules for a through route, which was a big complicated schedule that showed the entire route. SEPTA is now marketing and advertising the services as two services instead of one through service. Part of it was that there was a perception that the public was confused by having an R number on either side of the system and getting on the wrong train. I don't know how much of that was apocryphal, but it spread like wildfire. And as a result, certain people at SEPTA took hold of that and thought, well, let's get rid of these R numbers. It's just confusing for people to think this way. So the system now is basically 13 different timetables, each with their route name as described here, as opposed to showing it as some through service. There is some reference in the timetable to the other, to trains that go through, but you have to really look at it and then pick up the other timetable to figure out what time you get to that other location. Yeah, that's kind of what we were trying to avoid. The center city zone, particularly with Temple University becoming more prominent on the Reading side, has become the core focus. So, and University City and 30th Street Station are emerging as a second central location for jobs, which is more rapidly developing than the Market East side. So not everything was perceived. There are still through trains, but you have to go look for them from a marketing standpoint. As far as the impact on redevelopment, what about that vision of Market East becoming the new downtown? Well, what has happened is with the tunnel, this is showing you a cross section from 30th Street Suburban Station to Market East. There is one lone building in the Market East area. The Center City 30th Street Station was actually built with the foundation. Market East was actually built with the foundations for two high-rise buildings to be built over it, which has never materialized. But what has happened was developers, and this is partially because of some poor decisions by the city of Philadelphia to put incentives for high-rise development versus the tunnel. But with the tunnel, the city has decided that the suburban station area should be the center focus and the only place where high-rise buildings are allowed to be really high-rise. City Hall, you can see there, the rule used to be you couldn't build higher than City Hall. So the only place you can build higher than City Hall now is in that suburban station area. So those 50s, 60s eras high-rises that I spoke about that were built by Penn Center, those have all been torn down, and higher high-rises have been built on on there. So there's been a even greater concentration in the suburban station area. 30th Street Station is just starting to emerge as a new complex, and Market East continues to be a sad, lonely place where tumbleweeds roll the streets. So let me jump from there and go into quickly VRE and what we're looking at. VRE, we're the commuter rail system in the south of Washington, D.C. We run on existing railroad tracks. We serve D.C. and Northern Virginia, carrying longer distance commuters to D.C., Arlington, and Alexandria. We consist of 2 lines, 90 miles, both of which run on host railroads, not our own railroad. We add a lot of peak capacity to some very crowded highways in the area. We currently carry about 20,600 daily trips, and a number of surveys have demonstrated that repeatedly that those commuters would otherwise drive if we weren't there. Where our riders go. We serve the company town. The blue circles indicate where our destinations are, and they're primarily clustered in DC and the area. Our busiest station is not Union Station, but actually L'Enfant Station in the district by a factor of 2. L'Enfant, our Union Station and Crystal City are our second and third destinations. Both of those combined equal the ridership at L'Enfant, so that just gives you a sense of L'Enfant is a clear winner. And our fourth major destination is Alexandria. We have a little bit of interline of non-CBD ridership. If you look carefully, you can see a blue dot at Lorton, where people do leave cars so that they can get to the nearby Army Fort there. And Quantico Circle, well, it's a small circle, is we have almost as many people who get off the train there at Quantico every day. So there's some potential at those locations for reverse commute. But as you can see, the yellow circles where people originate, we primarily carry people from large park and ride lots in the outlying area and carry them into those core 4 stations. We've often talked about and worked with MARC and WMATA and Amtrak on regional collaboration. The Amtrak lines, and particularly we have a arrangement with them for a step-up fare. Someone who has bought a multi-trip pass on VRE for a small fee can ride the Amtrak train, which provides an express option for passengers using the longer distance trains, and provides more riders for Amtrak as well for a longer distance trip. We certainly work closely with Metrorail. We have Metrorail connections at 5 of our stations. But MARC service in Baltimore, we've been working for years. We've had a fare integration where it comes and goes. There was a point where MARC would recognize our fares and we'd recognize their fares so that someone could ride through in the rush hours. Unfortunately, the Maryland legislature eliminated their recognition. We still recognize MARC fares, but they don't recognize ours. But we are actively engaged in a study here, a regional study here, of looking at those opportunities for through running and for operations. Of course, the core is Long Bridge, which is the bridge across the Potomac, which right now is 2 tracks, is ours, and the freight system's critical bottleneck. So that and other infrastructure improvements are necessary for us to truly see a regional rail network operating here. But we are engaged in those conversations and trying to identify the market right now. Our system plan, which was adopted in January of 14, specifically states that by 2040 we want to transition towards regional rail with more bidirectional and frequent service in the peak periods and more midday and evening service with a whole goal. And it's identified that if we do that, we will double our ridership to about the range of 53,000 a day by 2040 if we do so. So we have a system plan which involves a number of physical improvements, both in terms of providing additional tracks on the CSX line, as well as improving our stations to provide for longer and more trains. Phase 1, which is what we're still engaged in right now, is to run longer trains. Phase 2 and 3 involves us running more trains over CSX in order to have the slots in the contract to provide those trains. CSX wants us to make these physical improvements. So that plus the Long Bridge will provide a great opportunity to really see a regional bidirectional system. We like to use, well, at least I like to use the term mini metro. so it's not confused with Metro itself, but that whole notion of more frequent service. So that's an overview. Back to you, sir.
Leave that pretty picture up. So I kind of made an executive decision. I'm going to act as the moderator for the rest of the panel here, because I want the professor to kind of jump in some of these questions we came up with. But first of all, I want the rest of the panel. We'll start with Peter. I have the rest of the panel actually kind of introduce themselves and then kind of what they got them here, kind of thing. So start off with Peter real quick.
My name is Peter Brassard, and I'm the chair for the Rhode Island Association of Railroad Passengers. I'm also a member of TransitMatters and was one of the co-writers for the white paper, Regional Rail for Metropolitan Boston.
My name is D.W. Rollins. I'm a contributing author for Greater Washington, which is a urban planning and transportation website in the DC area. I think I was specifically invited because of the article series I wrote recently talking about circumferential suburb-to-suburb connections, but I've also written a couple of articles about regional rail in the DC area.
My name is Laurie Schintler, and I'm associate professor in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. I have a couple of roles there. One is that I direct our master's program on transportation policy, operations, and logistics, and we have one of our former students here in the room, Malcolm Kenton. Thank you, our star student. If you have any questions. Yes. Any questions about the master's program, he'll be happy to answer them for you, also me. And I'm also in the Center for Regional Analysis as the Associate Director of Data and Technology Research Initiative. So I work heavily in the area of we'll call it regional analysis or regional science with a heavy emphasis on transportation. My current areas focus on emerging technologies, automation, big data, and those kinds of things, and also inclusive and diverse transportation.
And we've met.
Okay, so leave that there. So I'll jump right into it. We heard earlier from the Amtrak folks. One of the questions was asked about the difference between the long distance and state support, their corridor service, and who's going to pay for everything. So we have the same issue when it comes to, and Peter and I have worked together on MBTA issues, and we mentioned the Big Dig earlier, and that's we don't mention that project that didn't exist. It's a very beautiful greenway now. So we can kind of go through various examples in your careers, but who pays for a system like this for us to go into a regional rail kind of opportunity in DC, New York, California, wherever it is in the country? How do we? Who pays for this, and what's the kind of the best avenues to really kind of fund systems like this?
I think, first of all, it's going to be a share of government, so it'll be local, state, and federal. It's right off the bat, there are programs and there is money available to start at least on a study level, but much more money would have to be funded or funded the country. I mean, just as far as examples for now, there's for the Northeast, there's the Transportation Climate Initiative. That would be one possibility. FRA CRISI grants, FTA capital investment grant programs, FTA pilot programs, rehabilitation, railroad rehabilitation and improvement financing, and DOT build program. But what could be done on the state and local level, for one, would be tax incremental financing to fund areas around where train stations would be. Congestion pricing, which New York just approved, would be another. And then, the usuals of gas tax, sales tax, other kinds of transportation funding.
I don't have that much to add to that. Tax increment financing is certainly a useful idea for this, though given that in cities like DC and New York, it's likely to get spent on the local subway that probably brings more people, and that's particularly an important thing to consider for regional rail in cities that are newer to having transit, where regional rail that you're putting in would in fact be the primary rail transit, I think.
Thank you. I agree with all the points made so far and very much answered the question. But I like to kind of think out of the box and think go beyond the traditional means of financing transportation systems. Of course, we have all these gas tax and sources of money from federal, state, local government, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we need to start thinking about other kinds of ways that we can finance transportation, perhaps even tapping into some of the indirect effects that come from, benefits that come from like a regional rail system. Developers benefit from that, and having, these kinds of other parties outside of the transportation system perhaps help to fund things. And we know that Amazon is coming in. Would they not have a big pot of money for us? Maybe.
They like our plans, but they don't necessarily want to finance any of them. But we've had that discussion. No, I likewise agree with everything here. Unfortunately, I think we also, as you suggested, we need to be looking beyond the traditional sources and looking for non-traditional sources. I think it's telling of how the current administration has redefined the commuter tunnel improvements into New York City. I can't think of a more critical rail project in this country right now. If you just say it was it was built in 1910, and ignoring Sandy and all of that, we just didn't know a lot about tunnels back then. It's good to have a second tunnel that's built with modern technology, so we can go back and look and see what's really happening with the old tunnel. But that's no longer defined by the FRA and FTA as a project of national significance. It's just a local commuter project. So from that standpoint, when you look to the west, the improvements in commuter rail, Albuquerque, all throughout California, Denver, Salt Lake City, those are being funded by locally derived sources of revenue. There is some federal money in the pot, but it's certainly 80% money disappeared many years ago, and even 50% money is getting harder and harder to find. So from that standpoint, we can't be looking at the traditional formula stuff. SEPTA, the commuter rail tunnel, was built 80% federal money. That was a $330 million project. Boy, that was a lot of money back then. Now you can't break the ground for that. Yeah. But in any event, in the Washington area, the VRE is funded by funding from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and from other sources. We have about $90 million of additional improvements going on our Manassas line right now, because we're parallel to the I-66 highway that is being tolled. We're getting that money from tolls because we're seen as a contributor to the highway network in terms of taking traffic off the road. So that wasn't an easy case to make, but we made it, and we were very successful. In fact, as far as the other funding agencies are concerned, we were far too successful with that compared to the competing projects. So, but we have to look towards those sources. Tolled highways, trying to tap into development that's attributable. All of those, Southern Florida is being funded in large part by taxes on rental cars in South Florida. There are many ways to skin the cat, and we have to figure that out and what works locally. But the point is most of those are going to be locally derived, as opposed to looking towards the state or our states or our federal government from providing that.
Is that fair to have the local pay for it when in fact a regional rail impacts so many people beyond the local area?
When you're talking about super local, as I would say, as opposed to that gets interesting because we have funding pots that, for example, NVTA money, Northern Virginia Transportation Authority money, can't be spent on projects in D.C. And as we have stations in D.C. There is sometimes an issue. It hasn't popped up lately, but the last time we went out for rolling stock, our jurisdictions on the Manassas line were saying, why is our money being spent on cars that could be run down to the Fredericksburg line and be in another jurisdiction? Fortunately, we cleared that one, but that's the type of questions that come up. The whole notion of, we haven't even gotten to the discussion with Mark of them having to go to Annapolis and explain why there's a lot of ridership for Marylanders to benefit from going into Virginia. That would be catastrophic. Ken will remember when I was railroad administrator in Delaware, and we tried to convince Mark to go to Wilmington, and it was just unheard of in Annapolis to go out of state. We then did later on, subsequently in 2005, did a study for a Maryland county that demonstrated that Mark would save $5 million in operating expense a year. The operating expense would go down by $5 million a year if they ran to Wilmington versus going to Perryville as they do today.
We're going to get to go to Wilmington.
But Ken, what year is this we are now in? It's like I would have cashed that check that week if I was Mark. But when you're dealing with these boundaries, that's a good portion of it.
You mentioned, I want to aside. You mentioned South Florida and thinking outside the box when it comes to paying for things. And we're all familiar with Brightline. We were just down in Miami for our fall conference last year, and so if not federally or state locally funded, what role would PPPs, public-private partnerships, play in something like this? Is it possible for them to, like, in the kind of more hyper local level, can they kind of come in and, like, Brightline gets their money from development and kind of subsidizes the trains that way, but it actually is becoming a major player in Florida. Is there anything they could do other regions or here in DC, something like that?
I think the way that they would enter into it would have to be through some potential real estate development, because what would be in it for them to get involved with procurement or with operations? There's no incentive. But if there's an agency or state that has money, that has land, it could be swapped for improvements, and I would think more along the lines of train stations that are adjacent. That would be an opportunity. But beyond that, I don't see where the incentives would be for a private side to have that much involvement with basically a transit operation.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's roughly my assessment. In Maryland, we actually have a light rail line that's being built as a public-private partnership, but in that case, the state is essentially paying a private concessionaire to build and operate the line. It's not really expected that the company would be making a profit off it if it wasn't for the fact that we were paying the operating costs to them. But potentially in terms of real estate, you could see something, or in a situation like with Amazon, with a company that had slightly less bargaining power, you could potentially see them pushing for, if they wanted to build a large office development somewhere, pushing for better service to it.
Right, and I think about, okay, these are good points about, the real estate sector and whatnot, and people like Amazon, companies like Amazon. But I also think about the companies like Uber and Lyft getting into the transportation business, and pretty soon, my feeling is they're going to own our cities. And so we need to be thinking about partnerships with these kinds of private sector entities as well.
Uber being a sponsor for this event and for tonight.
Yeah, two points. The Taiwan high-speed rail system was financed entirely by development rights. Basically, the rail operator gets 50 years exclusive development rights around for a 5-mile radius around each station location, which was their incentive. I was supposed to come up with the operating plan for that, and that was supposed to be a for-profit operation. I couldn't figure out how that was going to be a for-profit operation until I found out about the real estate deal. I was like, oh, then they don't care, because that's where the money is being made. And but that works better with a new operation like Brightline or something that's a greenfield, as opposed to trying to adapt that into paying for an existing agency's operations either directly or indirectly, as the Purple Line does. The other thing I wanted to mention, there was a second thing I wanted to mention. Maybe I'll remember it after you're done.
DW, you got
Speaking of greenfield projects that are privately funded, there's the sort of controversial DC-Baltimore maglev, which, given its length, is essentially regional rail, which supposedly is going to be entirely privately funded, although I've never been able to make sense of how they expect to make a profit off of it. But
getting off of the who pays for things. And then we have.
I guess I wanted to address one of the points that was brought up is boundaries. So one of the biggest challenges is these agencies or states that don't want to talk to each other. It happens at the MTA between Long Island Railroad and Metro North, where they don't cooperate. I guess I'm not sure how it would be done, but is there a way to begin to merge systems or create a greater authority over them so that then more cooperation could be developed in creating these systems?
Yeah, actually, that leads me to my next question. Actually, so part of the reauthorization, the FAST Act, the wonderful draft that's put together by Sean and the rest of the office. One of our top bullet points is actually how do we create a urban suburban model akin to the S-Bahn in Germany here in the States, and and how do we find the proper funding for things like that? And it was talked about earlier, again with the state supported corridors with Amtrak on a national network level. How do these agencies actually work together? And also, so we'll go with that question. Like, so how do we get these agencies to kind of collaborate? But also, as we have a room full of advocates, how do we advocate better to talk to our elected officials to kind of force the issue of getting where they don't want to talk to each other? MassDOT and our examples back home, MassDOT, MBTA, same sphere, but their offices seem to be very disconnected. And so how do we as advocates push for things like that? So let's And Peter, if you want to start off, you were kind of leading toward that question.
No.
TW.
I don't have.
I have at least a quick answer while everybody else thinks of theirs. I think probably the best example of where multiple agencies are involved, and let me just say, after perspective of 42 years, creating new agencies is not necessarily the good answer. Creating a new bureaucracy and a new set of hierarchies. California does it best, I think, with their joint power authorities, where various individual authorities can get together and form a board to govern a new operation without compromising any of their sovereignty of the individual agencies, but finding a collaborative way to finance and to fund and to operate operations, whether it be for a specific line like the Peninsula Commute Line or the Capital Corridor are examples of JPAs, or whether it be for a single building like the Trans-Bay Terminal reconstruction. That was a separate JPA for that, which helps because then there's one place where all the complaint letters can go into. In the case of VRE, I skipped the slide that I normally show, which is we don't exist. VRE is actually the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, not to be confused with the Transportation Authority, which is, we'll get into the alphabet soup another day, and the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission, two transportation commissions with defined territories in which we operate. The two of them combined wanted to, 30-some years ago, run commuter trains. So what they did was they created a joint board, a joint subcommittee of both boards, which meet separately and they govern us. So we have this mechanism by which, my paycheck at VRE said PRTC on it. It never said VRE. We don't have an accounting department. That's because it's done from our parent. So you need to be somewhat creative somehow. But we're going through this a little bit right now with the MARC discussion, and I don't think Annapolis is going to give up or want to go to Virginia. I don't think we'll be able to convince either of our commissions that we want to go to Maryland, but we can find a mutuality of interest through some sort of a joint mechanism like that where nobody nobody loses their sovereignty.
Could I suggest a few things? One is maybe looking outside of transportation to see other kinds of I'll just call them meta organizations and how they work and see which ones are successful and which ones are not. But there's also a very important fundamental question here, and that is, do we want to use if we're going to go in this kind of direction, do we want to use a bottom-up or top-down approach? So bottom-up would be something where there are incentives for the different groups to collaborate and come together, whereas top-down would be, okay, we're creating this organization, everybody's within it, and here are how things are going to work. So these are some of the things I think that need to be considered.
Further on that, I guess then if it makes more sense in a way that it would be a bottom-up, because then everyone would get on board, but there really has to be incentives put in place. And then what would those be for the agencies? And usually it means money. Where's the money coming from? So it's kind of a chicken and egg. How would we go about that to then be able to advocate?
I don't think I've got much to add to all of that, honestly.
It's okay. Actually, so I'm going to get this. This is a question that everyone can get kind of involved. So Abe, during his presentation, mentioned how people get here. Buses, trains, cars. And the sense, and not just Amtrak, because it's. And I've learned, especially with my work with Last Mile, First Mile, is that it's not just getting from points A to B anymore. It's how do you get from C, D, E, and F. How do you take an Amtrak train from? You take the Chief. From Chicago to LA. How do you get around once you actually get to the station? Because my thought is like our memberships shouldn't just stop at those doors. How do we get our members, our people, our commuters around various cities? And with regional rail, the idea that bikes and scooters and the Ubers of the world are all going to have to work together. And so I think that's one of the things that if some cities don't have an actual robust commuter rail already, where we're trying to build, a much bigger train, network as is Boston, DC, and in Philadelphia. How do we take those examples of multimodal and turn them into more robust city? That's kind of an example that anyone could take, and it actually kind of fills into how do we take these examples across the country in other regions that are looking to build, transit systems but don't have the trains. So how do we use that multimodal first mile, last mile to our advantage? You want to start us off?
So I think one thing to consider is, especially if we're managing to build regional rail networks that work more like an RER or an S-Bahn, keep in mind that a lot of times, for example here, if you look at regional job centers besides downtown, a good number of them, Rockville, Silver Spring, Crystal City, Alexandria, are along regional rail lines. And if we can try to not have services that are all structured to, we're just taking people to one downtown station, it's going to make it a lot easier, particularly in cities like DC, where the downtown station isn't really well located for where downtown is. Downtown is half a mile west of Union Station. But even in cities where you've got something that is pretty well located, not all the jobs are downtown anymore, and we need to take advantage of the fact that we can have stations that are built to be destinations besides our one downtown hub.
I guess also with some places have separate bus systems from the trains, or the trains are not developed at all. It's also a question of reworking existing bus transit systems so that then there is a hub network that might be created at stations to then feed the trains and then feed the buses both ways. And it's not just an Uber or bicycle. Some of it's bicycle, some of it's Uber, but it's got to be a combination of all of those.
As I mentioned in my presentation, there were some suburban office parks that were beyond a reasonable walk, but weren't too far, again, almost last mile, from a train station that in order to make those accessible, we provided the 200 series routes. The 200 series routes were designated as such because, one, there was a through fare. That was the only place you could transfer from a commuter rail line with a one fare to a bus operation in the SEPTA system. And secondly, it was also a route that was dedicated because people won't transfer to a bus they don't trust is going to be there. So from that standpoint, the bus has to be broken off from the rest of the system, and actually, when trains are late, it waits, which drives the bus operations people nuts because, as they say, you're paying a guy to be late. You know, he needs to run on his schedule. So we had to work those things out, which highlights the other thing I want to bring out, which is we've talked a lot about external partnerships and such. The more multimodal your agency is, the more trouble you're going to have internally. The SEPTA 200 series routes would have been implemented about 1.5 years earlier if it was not for the internecine debates about where the revenue gets associated. If we set a rule, as we did, all passengers with a multi-trip ticket get to transfer free to this bus. Well, what you end up with is the rail people get extra revenue for selling reverse peak seats that they would have otherwise gone empty. So with no additional operating costs, they get more revenue. The bus people, all they know is this bus comes back to the depot every day with the empty fare box. It's a loser. So it literally took us 1.5 years in SEPTA to deal with those issues between the operating divisions as well as with the revenue department to attribute the benefits of service to the right location as opposed to just where they were collected. And that's where the 200 series came about. But it's not just saying start up a bus route and make it work. It's actually somewhat easier. South Florida has a number of dedicated shuttle routes at stations going to nearby areas, and they just contract with other operators. And that's somewhat an easier case because then there's just an invoice and a check that's cut, as opposed to working internally. So don't overestimate the ease of a large multimodal organization with dealing with these things.
Professor.
Going on this topic, you mentioned that it makes sense to redesign your bus network to use regional rail hubs as bus hubs. And this makes sense in theory, but there are a couple things you need to keep in mind if you're doing it. One of which is fare integration. And even in cities where I can get on any bus or subway train in DC or Baltimore using the same RFID card, but if I want to ride MARC, I have to go and buy a paper ticket that's on Amtrak ticket stock that doesn't fit in my wallet. So first of all, technology integration. Make sure that one of the wonderful things about the contactless and RFID technology that we use for fare media now is it's easy for it to keep track of and automatically calculate your transfers. But you've got to have everything, including the regional rail systems that like to operate like an old school railroad, to actually use them. And the other is fare integration in terms of having free transfers and not having, as it is in a lot of cities, particularly New York, regional rail is a premium service that costs more because you end up with a lot of people who, coming from, say, Jamaica to downtown New York, you can get to Midtown a lot faster from Jamaica by taking LIRR, but you're going to be paying an obscene amount that most people in Jamaica can't afford, so they take the subway even though it's a much longer trip. We need to make sure that we're not running two separate transit systems, one for rich suburbanites and one for poorer people within the city, if we expect people to take the train inside the city rather than taking a bus, even if it's slower or more indirect. And
yeah, that was one of the main premise, or one of them, with the regional rail for Metropolitan
TransitMatters.
Boston, that everything has to be integrated as far as the fare structures. Also, we're dealing with two states, although one of them is a much smaller component, but there still needs to be cooperation there. What we were proposing for Boston is that within the 128 highway loop, which is the inner part of Boston, that would be the same as the subway or bus. And then from the Rhode Island side, that all RIPTA and MBTA trains would be, again, free transfers and the same rate for within the state. But that's critical. Otherwise, I guess it's transit or regional rail is really an egalitarian transit system that we're proposing that doesn't exist today. And it's very American to have things separated by class, even though we're supposed to be the classless society. But that still is the case, especially with rail transit, and we need to integrate the fare structures.
I agree with all these points, and I think that the last mile issue is really big, and it's probably where we see most of the challenges. And I just want to make the point that when we definitely want seamless transportation as we move from one mode to another, and fare integration is one aspect of it. But I think also we need to make sure that we have plenty of options in terms of last mile transport, and I'm thinking in particular of mobility impaired. Just need to think about those things. But I'm kind of curious here. This panel is on future of regional rail, and so what I actually wanted to start out with is what is our vision for the future of regional? Oh, you're getting to that.
Yeah, actually, because we've gotten into a lot. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But we've gotten into a lot of like who pays and the
Right.
current situations. But before we kind of turn it over to the audience, I wanted to get through everybody. What does the future look like? I've a little self-promotion. The staff writes a series of blogs on our website. I've actually written about vision, and if we don't have the entire kitchen sink of ideas for every city across this country, whether it be Amtrak long distance, adding the corridor service with the long distance trains, and just adding on top layers on top of layers. What are we doing? Like, what if we don't have? If we're not striving to have the single greatest robust transit system in the world? What are we doing in this room? Whether it be Amtrak or regional rail. So that said, kind of like those fighting words, what could the future look like? In our mega regions, our mega cities, for everyone to go home to, what should we be fighting for? What is the 2040, 2050 vision? And I kind of I want to leave it there, and we'll kind of turn it over to the audience.
Yeah, so it's what should we strive for in the future, and what could we strive for in the future, right? But there's the other aspect here, and that is it's what we want versus what the consumers want.
Those two platforms now, and we're funding them without Mark's help. So, because there's no point in asking Maryland to fund either of those, but we would certainly accept that funding if that was possible. That said, I think the future of regional rail is happening whether we want it to or not, which is to say, with the information technologies, what we used to do by integrating, trying to make the timetables seamless, trying to make the fares seamless so you paid once and just carried that through the system. That's now happening. It's called smartphones. Everybody's carrying them. The generation, I know my daughter's generations expect stuff, and then in places like Uber have raised expectations to where everybody expects that information to all be available. So from an information standpoint, and to a degree from a fare technology standpoint, once somebody decides to bite the bullet and join the 21st century, or at least the latter part of the 20th century, the fares are being integrated. It gets to be a challenge for an agency. We're already collecting the dollar one way. Collecting it another way, spending $2 to collect it another way is not a big incentive. But each agency is finding different ways. We're working right now with Amtrak to put our fare system. You can do everything you need to do with a fare on a smartphone for VRE. We're working with Amtrak to integrate both our schedule information and our purchases through their system as well. So you don't have to go from one app to another app. It all happen in one place. But that's just happening the information technology is overtaking the inertia that some of us have. By the way, it's kind of interesting. Even Amtrak nowadays, I travel Amtrak regularly. I haven't had a paper ticket on Amtrak for the longest time, even though some of their, like Mark, still requires the actual paper ticket from Amtrak.
Yeah, and I just came across the other day these different dashboards which integrate different transportation systems within regions and provide real-time information on operating characteristics of the different modes and information on fares and whatnot. And I think going in this kind of direction would be absolutely wonderful. In fact, one dashboard I saw, you can say, I need to go from GMU campus in Fairfax to the Starbucks in DuPont Circle, and it will give you all your different options, including multimodal, tell you the cost and the travel time and all that. And I think we need to go into this kind of direction. Yeah.
Google does a wonderful job with transit and such. I've regularly used to run multimodal tours of different cities and such as part of APTA operations. And at one point, I wanted to figure out, I really wanted to get everybody down to Colorado Springs from Denver. And I said, but what options are there? And Google Transit had just started. And I opened it up and asked the question. It told me, bus leaves in 12 minutes. Didn't even know the bus existed. But they did, and that information was there. And you asked the right question, they line up the trip for you.
I guess one closing comment, since this seems to be a beating up on Mark session, is, but to be clear, this is a problem. What?
They could have come.
But to be clear, this is a problem that applies to nearly every commuter railroad in the country, which is that whole issue of it's not just that they don't have frequent service, but outside of rush hour, they can have some pretty ridiculous gaps. Just as an example, today I have another conference to go to in Baltimore this afternoon. And the keynote speaker is at 6:30, so I won't be able to get to Penn Station until like 7:45. Turns out that there's a gap in service from 7:35 to 9:30. So I'm actually going to be taking Amtrak back home, even though that's completely ridiculous for a trip that should be served by regional rail, just because otherwise I'd have to sit around for an hour and a half in Baltimore Penn Station waiting for a train, not that late in the evening.
One of the fights in MBTA, regional rail, is actually they're calling for all day service, and some lines don't even have all day service. They don't even have everyday service. So it'd be great to have all day if they actually worked on like Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, and not just the prime time. So I want to get ready for the moment. I want to turn it over to the audience if anybody has any questions. Bruce will pass the microphone around.
Thank you. Chris Nadelbeck from Kew Gardens, New York, and I live right over the Long Island Railroad tracks. And I do take the subway to avoid the higher cost of going in from Kew Gardens into Penn Station, except when I'm taking the morning Amtrak train because I don't want to rely on the subway. But seriously, does the panel, this is open to anyone on the panel. In New York and New Jersey, we have been trying for years to integrate into a regional rail system. But we have a lot of institutional resistance, a lot of political resistance. It's two different states. We have New Jersey Transit, we have the MTA, all of which it doesn't appear that they themselves are or can see the benefits to their riding public of developing a regional rail system. Do you have any ideas or any experience with overcoming institutional resistance between multiple governments and multiple transit agencies to develop the regional rail system?
You struck a nerve. The problem with New York City, the New York City region, is it is the largest metropolitan area in the country, and it does not have a singular metropolitan planning organization since Tri-State was abolished in the 70s. So as a result, you have, even when you step beyond the MTA, New Jersey Transit, and those parochial interests, you step up, there is no singular organization that is charged with looking out for everybody's interests. NIMTIC looks out for New York interests. NJTPO looks out for, actually, the Northern New Jersey Transportation Planning Organization doesn't even look out for all of New Jersey, and CONDOT has its own. So you end up with a project like the Gateway Project, which as originally conceived was a through tunnel that didn't stop at 34th Street and Penn Station, but continued to lower level of Grand Central. And the first thing the MTA said was, why do we want to go to New Jersey? And that was, and in all the various iterations over the decades of that project, it keeps coming up and it keeps getting knocked down because the MTA doesn't see their job as moving people through the region. They see their job, and they have a daily miracle to perform of performing that job. They see their job of getting their commuters from a traditional market into a traditional job center and not going beyond that. That's what MPOs are for. That's why New York needs an MPO. The RPA, the Regional Plan Association, which is a private organization, has keep stirring that pot, but they have no voice in the game. And the whole notion of why MPOs were created in the first place back in the 70s was to make us transit agencies think beyond the box and to think about how best to affect their regional.
So do you think, this is just one follow-up, so do you think, I know someone in the panel mentioned bureaucracies aren't always the best answer. I know that one bi-state agency we have is the Port Authority. So would you, which has its own problems. So, I mean, a lot of people snickering over here.
They have their problems, but they come to the table with money. So that's, what a tangled web we weave when we first take subsidy. You come to the table with money. Port Authority is probably the best answer for it if you could convince them to take that up.
Hi. Not quite 20 years ago, I worked on a run-through study for market VRE. And
I've got that study, Ken.
What?
I've got that study.
And another problem with L'Enfant is a platform that conforms to modern standards of size would have to have been located in the center, and that leads to the requirement for escalators, which VRE didn't want to deal with. And, you can see how it blows up the cost. But I'd like to make a suggestion beyond it. If you looked at Washington from 30,000 feet, 50 years out, the place for a Union Station is L'Enfant, because you've got 4 metro lines, and you're as close to the business district and almost as close to the capital, and you could run the trains up Virginia Avenue Tunnel out to Landover instead of going around the corner through the other tunnel, except you could still run the B&O train, the trains up the B&O to the west. And I would just urge that to be considered, that L'Enfant is the real place Union Station should be, and Daniel Burnham's Union Station should be given to some kind of federal use.
Without getting too far into the details, I'll be happy to get into the details with you, Ken. But that's the right incentive. That's what brings Mark to the table, at least Mark's staff to the table to talk to us, because they see the same incentive. They only bring their passengers to Union Station, and yet we demonstrate on a daily basis, it's our third busiest station. They want to get to L'Enfant just as urgently. And it's looking beyond that, beyond the status quo that it brings Mark to the table. And CSX has already forbidden electrification in any way, shape, or form.
Patrick?
So one thing I wanted to know, particularly for those of you who have worked with public agencies here, and is how much have you considered looking not just within the U.S., but particularly at what they do in foreign countries? To give a simple, especially when it comes to fare integration. To give a particular example, and it's interesting that you mentioned the Port Authority, because they are actually the villains in this example, so to speak. If I want to get from where you lived in Brooklyn to the airport, I would have to pay 3 fares. One to the subway, one to the Long Island Railroad, and one to the Port Authority for the air train. Meanwhile, you go to, say, Seoul or Tokyo, where many of the rail operators are private. They are not beholden to government action in the same way, and they have figured out ways to say, if you are going this distance, you always pay this one fare, no matter how, no matter which, set of trains you are using. And they figured out a way to basically corral all these disparate operators into a single fare scheme. And how much have public authorities looked at saying, okay, let's look at how in other countries they are corralling disparate operators into a single fare scheme, something the U.S. seems very bad at.
I'm not an expert in other countries, so I'm going to pass that on to the rest of the panel, but I wanted to comment on something you brought up about electrification. We've sort of been ignoring private companies as part of it, but outside of a few cities in the Northeast, private companies own the track regional rail runs on. And a big problem is convincing them to, for example, the Camden line, one of Mark's lines, I live right along it, and in the middle of the day, one of the reasons they can't run all-day service on it is CSX likes to park trains on the running tracks. This doesn't really make operational sense if you want to run passenger service, but they're a private company. They don't care. Another example is double stack freight. You can run double stack freight under pantographs. Norfolk Southern does it in a couple places in the Northeast Corridor. But in general, American freight operators just don't want to, so they say it's impossible, and if they own the tracks, we need to find some way to, if we're going to actually build good regional rail networks, find some way to get the private corporations to work with commuter rail rather than just seeing it as something they're forced to do but are going to accept as little of as possible.
Peter, the regional, the fare integration was a big part of TransitMatters, so if you want to take that.
I was going to jump back, though, to a different topic as far as advocates and what we should... Is it on? Yeah. Okay. As far as advocates and the MPOs and the situation with New York, but also Boston is similar, where there's multiple, either it's DOTs or transit agencies that don't cooperate. As a push, at least on the federal level, as we're advocating, can't we ask or plead to please create larger MPOs or make it easier for states or regions to do that? I think it's really about, because these regions have grown over time, whereas New York keeps expanding, DC area keeps expanding, they all have. So, we need to then change the formula. It's not the 70s anymore as far as what we're trying to advocate for. Just wanted to...
So we have time for well, I want to make sure that Hendrik's
let me just
question got
bring-
answered,
let me
but
just
we only
bring-
have time for one more question.
Let me just quickly bring up that point. Going back to Bruce's presentation earlier about Metrolinx, why is all that wonderful stuff happening in there? The initials are GTA, and I noticed on your presentation it's now GTHA. They've had a regional government, what we call MPO, with power and teeth and funding abilities for generations, and you're seeing the results in Metrolinx, and you're seeing the results of not having it in New York. And that's why Tri-State was abolished, because they tried to do that.
All right, well, I want to get everyone to our break before our lunch starts, so I want to thank our panel for coming.